Hello, and welcome to my late 1800s home. For many Americans, dealing with copper piping is something that just isn't in their frame of reference. With new construction popping up all over the place, PEX piping is quickly becoming the way to replace copper piping in the houses. However, for many Americans living in existing homes like mine, copper and steel piping is a way of life and may or may not have to be dealt with at some point. For myself, I learned a long time ago how to work with copper piping, and so I thought I would take a moment and show others how to do the same. I am not a licensed contractor. I don't do this for a living. I'm a homeowner who's had to do his own projects. And one thing that I've always noticed is that dealing with copper piping can be intimidating. So I thought I would put this video together to help educate people on at least an idea of how to do it. So let's take a closer look at what we need to use before we get started actually doing the pipe work. Well, what I have here are all the tools needed to be able to solder, clean, and cut copper piping. Let's start with the copper tubing itself. Today we're going to be using a 1/2-inch copper tube. They come in various sizes, and one of the things you'll want to do is figure out what size tubing you're going to need based on what you have in your house. We're also going to use today a connector. And the goal today will be to cut this piece of tubing and use the connector to reconnect the two pieces together. Once you have the copper tubing picked out, the next is going to be the gas that you're going to use. We have propane and we have MAP gassing here. They can both be used very effectively for soldering copper tubing together. The propane tends not to heat up quite as much, and it can take longer to do the project. The one nice thing with the propane tubing, though, is for the most part it's really hard to overheat the pipe, and you tend to have more control of it. So if you're doing this for the first time, propane might not be a bad way to go. You also have the MAP gassing, and obviously the MAP gas tends to get much hotter, and so it heats the piping faster. Also, if you have leftover water in your line, the MAP gassing is also good for drying out that water quickly. You're going to use this, a sparker, to simply spark the gas to ignite it. There's various size cutters. This is the one that I use the most. They also make smaller ones, so if you're stuck inside, you're stuck in a small space and you need to work that piping out of the existing area, they're much smaller. But for our purposes, this tends to cut easier and faster just because of its size. So here we have a variety of sanding and cleaning tools. You'll notice this is for a 3/4-inch pipe. This is for the 1/2-inch pipe that we're using. And all you're going to do is stick that sander on the end like this, and spin it a couple times, and it tends to clean the piping off. Just gives it a nice surface for the solder to work with. They also make a sandpaper that's specially designed for copper piping too. After that, what you need is number 95 lead-free tinning flux. The tinning flux is going to create a vacuum that's going to suck the solder into the connection. And I'll show you how to use that in just a second. Finally, you need your solder, and you also need a brush. The brush is going to be used for the tinning flux to spread on the copper piping. Obviously, the solder is going to be used to solder the two pipes together. Now, all of these things come in smaller and larger containers depending on how often you're going to use it. So in terms of physically being able to do the job, those are the things you need to physically do the job. Other things you're going to need are safety glasses, and that's mainly because of the solder that may bounce off, the hot solder that may bounce off, which doesn't happen too often, but can, especially if you're working in areas overhead. Another thing that you're going to want to use, especially if you're putting it up into an existing area where there's old dry wood, is something like this. It's a flame retardant material with a foil exterior, and what you can do is put that up inside, in between the wood and the piping, and it acts as a flame retardant, so you don't essentially start your house on fire. For this purpose, for this demonstration, we will be using a vise. However, I do oftentimes use a vise grips as I do projects in the house, and that's largely because the pipe will get hot. And the vise grips are just a nice way to be able to hang on to that pipe without worrying about burning your hands. Another thing you can use too is obviously flame retardant gloves, heat resistant gloves, that sort of a thing. So those are basically the parts, the pieces that you need to be able to complete the job. Alright, so now you can see I have my copper piping in place. The vice grip is on. It's just tight enough to keep the copper pipe from sliding around. One of the things you really don't want to do is tighten the vice grip up so much that it crushes the piping. It's just enough to keep it in place, and what you'll really find is that there's not a whole lot of pressure that needs to be applied to these pipes when you do this. I've got my safety glasses in hand. I've got those now on my face, and I am ready to go. We're going to start by taking the cutter and simply getting it on the pipe. And really all the cutter is going to do, again, is what you're going to do is just put enough pressure on that pipe to start making a groove, and as you go around, you simply spin it. And all the time I'm turning this knob every time I go around to create pressure, to create a deeper groove. I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's a groove forming right there. And we're just going to keep cutting. This really is not hard. It only takes a little bit of pressure to do it. The thing is you just don't want to overcut it. You don't want to overcut it because you don't want to crush the piping in the process, but just one spin as you go. Now I've gotten it free, so I want to clean off this end. You can see it's cleaned it off just enough to get a nice shine on it. And now I'm going to clean this end. To speed things up just a little bit, I've already cleaned the inside of this. And now all I'm going to do is add my flux. Again, what the flux is designed to do is as this flux heats, it creates a vacuum. And what that vacuum is going to do is serve to suck the solder into the pipe, in between the pipe and the connection. You don't have to, but I always like to put just a little bit of flux on the inside here. Okay, so once you've got that in place, really all you need to do is slide that piece on, and now we're going to ignite the MAP gas. Simply turn it on, and you can hear it coming out. You can hear it quite loud. But all I'm going to do is start heating up that gas, or heating up the flux. As it heats, the trick is to get it hot enough so that the solder melts and goes in between. And the best way to do that is to just run that solder along the edge, and if it melts, it's good to go. Now you can see that the solder really isn't pooling, and the second you do it, it gets cold right inside there, and that's how you know it's working. So now that it's hot, we're simply going to take that other end, and we're going to stick that into place, and we're going to heat that other pipe. Now as it finally gets to the heat it needs to be, you can simply go around and line that solder up. Maybe heat it up one more time just to get the flux or the solder in there real good. Alright, there we go. Copper piping joined together using the single connector. Now, obviously a lot of this can be cleaned off using a rag or using some of that sandpaper I showed you earlier just to clean off the edges. But ultimately, it's soldered together. Water can flow through this tube freely, no problem. Well, I hope that helped you out. I hope I alleviated some of the questions you may have with regards to copper piping and maybe how to work with it. Maybe it alleviated some of the fears that you may have. And I hope you enjoyed the demonstration. My name is Jason Hammond. Thank you for coming to my basement.